Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast.
Greetings, Dr. Cogen Bohanec here. I'm assistant professor in Sanskrit and Jain Studies at Arihanta Institute, and I'm pleased to announce today that I'm going to be interviewing a wonderful scholar, Dr. Nathan Loewen, who's a professor of religious studies at the University of Alabama. He earned his PhD in modern philosophy of religion at McGill University in Montreal, where he also taught for several years before moving into a position in Vanier College, also in Montreal. Dr. Loewen's primary research is conducted with international collaborators on grant-funded projects affiliated with the global critical philosophy of religion. That research extends to a similarly named program unit at the American Academy of Religion. He also co-edits the Routledge Research in Religion and Development series, which explores the intersection between religious studies and international development studies. And another of his major interests is critical digital pedagogy, which analyzes how digital platforms, like podcasts, I suppose, shape higher education today. It's this research has led to his role as an academic special projects liaison for the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Alabama. In that role, Dr. Loewen assists faculty and administrators with quality assurance for online courses, tracks development in educational technology, and supports faculty development initiatives across the college and campus, including Quality Enhancement Program, Online Learning Innovation Summit. In 2018, Dr. Loewen published Beyond the Problem of Evil, Derrida and Anglophone Philosophy of Religion, a work that rethinks the concept of evil through the lens of Derrida's philosophy, which sounds amazing. In 2024, he published Diversifying Philosophy of Religion, and in 2025, Engaged Philosophy of Religions, all of which are things that I'm eager to ask him about. His forthcoming projects include Artificial Intelligence in 5 Minutes, Philosophies of Self, a cross-cultural introduction, and Theodicies of Empire, Legitimations of Political, Economies, and Regimes. Well, thank you, Dr. Loewen, for joining us today. Your work seems to be at the crossroad of philosophy, religion, critical theory, digital pedagogy, and it seems to be really influential in how scholars are reshaping how they think about the methodologies around the study of religion. That's really what stood out to me, and being something of a methodology geek myself, I was very eager to talk to you about all of this. So today I'd like to explore how your methodological commitments, especially your engagement with Derrida, inform your understanding of Jain philosophy in particular, which we'll get to, and what we're calling the subdiscipline of engaged Jainism. But before we get into the specifics of Jainism and engaged Jainism, I wonder if we could start with talking about the method and study of religion, like how you would describe your methodological approach to the study of religion. Maybe you could tell us about some scholars or texts or ideas that have really influenced your thinking and your approach to religious studies. So let's go ahead and start there.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on this podcast, Cogen. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you and to hear your ideas and your questions. I really appreciate you as a colleague, and I'm very excited at the opportunity to possibly engage with members of your audience. Whoever's out there, please know that I have an active email account that I check every day, and I'm always interested in finding new interlocutors. And maybe that relates to an overarching method piece. My interest in philosophy of religion is to widen the scope of interlocutors in that field. If you're familiar with the philosophy of religion, it's often something understood as engaging problems of theism. And of course, there are all sorts of interconnections with Jain Dharma and Jain philosophy, and with theism, fine. But what I'm interested in is what sorts of topics and categories and methods would allow a more robust set of engagements between philosophers of religion who are in the academia and in university institutions and a wider set of phenomena. And that's where the Global Critical Philosophy of Religion project comes in. We were very deliberate when we were talking about what this project is, and the we includes people from literally around the world, over 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen academics who've been involved and affiliated in various projects. But our question really was, okay, we want to make the scope global without replicating imperialism and Orientalism. And so adding that word critical in is really important for us, to include critical reflexivity and to pay attention to critical theory when we're doing our work as academics. I could ramble on, but that's my first method comment.
Yeah, that's it kind of alludes to I think what we might call like methodological accountability and responsibility, how it is that we as Western scholars in particular, or scholars in the Western Academy, I should probably say, how we engage with traditions that have been historically marginalized, and how scholarship in the past has actually contributed to that marginalization through intellectual imperialism, Orientalism that you mentioned there. And so you kind of see this work is sort of rectifying that pattern in the past, I suppose. Is that correct?
Yeah. And adding on to it's a yes and rather than a no but piece. If people are familiar with the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama, you can look us up at religion.ua.edu. Take a look at our faculty who are involved there and what their projects are, and you'll quickly see that I'm surrounded by colleagues who bring that same critical reflexivity to their fields, whether it's religions in Asia or the study of Islam or the study of religion in southern United States or the study of religion simply as a field itself. Probably the academics who might listen to this podcast are not unfamiliar with who my colleagues are. And I'd say the long history, if long as 40 years, but the history going back to the late 1980s and early 1990s of that critical turn in the study of religion that really has long, strong roots in this department. So I really appreciate the opportunity to work with the colleagues I have in this department who've really pushed me to think about how I do my work as an academic. It's been fabulous.
Yeah, that self-reflexivity is really, I think, important in scholarship for a lot of reasons. I think we as scholars, particularly in the Western Academy, have a bit of a hegemonic voice where we have the power to define traditions. And if we define traditions in a way that sort of goes against their own self-definition, there's the danger that our redefining of a tradition could displace the original and create erasure. That can be really problematic. It's something that I try to look out for in my own work as well too. But also it's interesting, particularly somebody who uses critical theory and critical lenses like you do, but of course all scholars do that, how it is maybe at a certain point that we can use critical lenses on marginalized traditions in a way that doesn't further marginalize them. This is something I think about a lot, and I know you've done some work in feminism as well too. Like a feminist critique on pretty much any any tradition or culture in the world is valid, right? Like we need to be levying them feminist critiques. But I think sometimes at a point when we're outsiders to a marginalized tradition, sometimes there's a danger that scholars can sort of reduce traditions to their, most their least common denominator, right? Like their worst sort of instances of the religion, expressions of
Right. Mhm.
discrimination. I think it's important that as scholars we try to have that, and I think that's part of like I don't know if you would use the word decoloniality, but when you talk about like intellectual imperialism or sort of trying to undo the maladies of Orientalism, that's where my mind goes at least. Yeah, yeah. So do you have any thoughts on how like specifically maybe your scholarship can sort of prevent the further marginalization of traditions?
Sure. Well, I'll stay at the large overarching question level rather than diving in. I think that the field of religious studies has a lot to learn from the field of international development studies. The critical turn in development studies really happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which is still during the Cold War It is not yet the period of globalization beginning in the 1990s, but in the 1980s, there had been that post-World War II period of countries emerging from their colonial past and being either granted independence or fighting for independence, and then trying to figure out how to function as new countries. India played a significant role in that with the non-aligned movement by Nehru, who also coined the term third world, where the idea was that you had the communist bloc and the Western bloc, but there was a third way of doing things, a third world that at the Bandung conference, Jawaharlal Nehru was very adamant in saying that a third world is possible outside of the concerns of these powers that would like to sway us in one direction or another. And so that kind of thinking started to get even stronger with a critical turn in development studies in the 1980s to rethink what is going on with either unilateral aid, like let's say from a Canadian or British or United States government aid perspective, or multilateral aid, let's say from the IMF or the World Bank, that nevertheless is still powerfully influenced by both Eastern and Western actors. And so in the 1980s, there was a real discussion about that, about what sort of economic development could be guided internally by the countries themselves without the interference of Cold War proxy politics to lead to genuine flourishing for their people. Amartya Sen, won a Nobel Prize for thinking this through, in large part his work with Jean Drèze on their book title, India and Development, really thought this through and proposed the capabilities approach for understanding how economic development might happen within a country. And I think that religion scholars would do well to take a look at the development studies discourse and see how their work relates to it. That's, my interest in that book series, and a publication that I still really want to get out and organize to continue thinking about that. Because man, I'm rambling still a little bit again, but let's not delude ourselves. Higher education is an arm of soft power of every country. If that's the case, religious studies scholars should not delude themselves into thinking they are not a part and parcel of the soft power operations of the country in which they reside. If that's the case, that is a very different insider-outsider question than the one that's typically asked in the study of religion, and we are remiss as scholars to not think about that question, both internally, what is our role in terms of the soft political power within our countries, and then externally, how are our relationships to both the people who might be involved in the objects of their study or our international collaborators? What's going on in terms of geopolitics in those relations? It's not like we have to foreground that all the time, but if you practice your scholarship without thinking about that, I think you are an irresponsible scholar.
Yeah, that really brings a lot of interesting questions. Higher education is a form of self-power. I think we can see this by how like area studies is often funded by the Department of Defense. And I think that scholars might sometimes inappropriately think that they're doing something that's not political and not in the interests of Western global hegemony.
Yeah. And if we learn anything from feminism, it's the phrase "the personal is political." That applies to the scholar's study
Yeah.
as much as it does to the interior of a household or the actions of a family group or the relationships that an individual might have with other members of society. It's also the scholar's work. Now, I know that people talk about activist scholars, and I remember a conversation I had with somebody in the Church State Studies program at Baylor University who tried to press me into a corner and said, "Are you going to just be a scholar or an activist scholar?" And I was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. Every scholar is an activist. If the personal is political, everything we do is activism." Now someone might counter and say, "Well, that means that nobody's an activist. If we're all activists, nobody's activist." And I'm like, "No, come on, man. Don't slouch off the social responsibility that happens the moment you step onto campus. And in the United States context, we are finally probably realizing what has always been true and also what has probably been better known by our international colleagues, that governments are highly invested in what we do and in knowing about what's going on. And so when the state of Alabama passes legislation that concerns itself with what are called divisive concepts, that reveals to me as a scholar that this whole time I have been involved in politics, that the scholar's study is not some Archimedean point in space and time separated from the world, as if there's an idea of an engaged scholar or an activist scholar versus not. I mean, the moment you mobilize that sort of a distinction, I think you've lost the lead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that that's particularly true as our political landscape moves more towards politicization of facts, of knowledge. I
Sure.
mean, any field of knowledge, like what you're discussing with the case of divisive concepts in Alabama. I mean, I assume they're probably referring to things like critical race theory and these things that a lot of times are just literally teaching the history of, like, race relations in America, like literally just presenting like even empirical historical facts
Somewhat.
somehow
I
political.
mean, it's important to note that that theory began in the University of Alabama Law School's department. So that's a really important thing to note. And that reviewing that scholarship is probably, again, highly important for any humanities and social sciences scholar to understand and position themselves. I'm fortunate to have the colleagues I have in the department I have. I think the religious studies department here has always been aware of that. It's never not been news to them. And that perhaps this is just a moment where people in the Ivy Leagues are finally realizing what those of us in public institutions in red states have known all along. And again, that our colleagues who work in IITs in India have known all along, or our colleagues in universities in various locations like Uganda, Nigeria, South Africa, they've also known these things all along. I
Yeah.
think that anyhow, we're getting a little bit off track, but also we're not. That when we're doing global critical philosophy of religion, those are the kinds of things that I think philosophers have really decided don't exist, that they're able to operate in what others have called an echo chamber, except instead of social media, it's the echo chamber of pure logic or reason alone. And while that's useful, right, we need to do thought experiments. We need to be able to isolate variables, set up controls. Like this is, analytic philosophy, scientific thinking. I understand we need to do those things, but at the end of the day, it's not like the work that we publish or the philosophy we do enters into a similarly vacuous historical geopolitical space. That's not true. And I think that even when we are studying Jain philosophers or Jain Dharma, I think Jain scholars maybe are better at this than others, but they think, okay, this has been a minority group. What was Haribhadra's geopolitical context? What was the social and historical circumstances? Why, or if we look at various rulers who have entertained Jain munis in their royal courts, I bet that that was a sensitive situation, that they weren't just doing philosophy in a vacuum. Or if we think about how Jain groups have navigated the political landscape of South Asia throughout the centuries, that's a really fertile ground for doing what I would call global critical philosophy of religion, where we can set those things into relief. And even when we think about the intersection with development studies, then we can see how and ask questions about the political sensitivity and the political utility of involvements in wider social dynamics. I mean, whether it's a bird hospital, fine, or thinking about vegetarianism or the treatment of cattle in milk production, fine, but also in terms of education and disaster response. There are ways of drawing clear, clean lines from Jain Dharma to those activities, but then there also are obviously fuzzy lines that scholars might wish to look at about what are the political and social effects of those engagements, and what are the calculations of the actors who are involved in those engagements.
Yeah, these are fantastic reflections. I mean, I think it's like, sounds like your work is really a call for us as scholars in particular to contextualize our situation, ask ourselves how we might be either complicit or resistant to forms of global power and global inequality, and also sort of how we contextualize religion within its political and global sort of milieu without trying to like look at things in their pure ideas or pure context. I think these are all very, very important sort of calls to being to ethical scholarship. That's great. But Kim, I was wondering if I could ask you about the other side of scholarship, teaching, because you do deal with pedagogy too, right? Like you have a monograph, effective social learning, a collaborative globally networked pedagogy. And I'm just wondering how these ideas, maybe the ones we've discussed or other ones, have sort of influenced your approach to pedagogy, your discourse on pedagogy, and maybe like how it affects how you teach in the classroom.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think if I want to draw a line, and again, I'm just thinking Jain studies here. So I think there's probably a line to be drawn between my involvements with the summer learning program with the International Jain Studies program way back in 2006 when I was a PhD student. That really helped me to start thinking these kinds of thoughts. I was already there, but it really pushed me. And then I went again and worked with ISJS in 2010, and that reinforced things for me. So thank you so much, to Silak Jain and Shugan Jain for those opportunities. They're very formative for me in all sorts of ways. And so applied to teaching, I think that the international composition of our classrooms is really important to inform that as well. Now, at McGill University and at Vanier College, I had the immense privilege of being in a classroom with lots of first generation newcomer students. Generally, in the classroom, we easily had 10 different fluent languages being spoken, and that allowed us to engage a wider variety of texts, a wider variety of sources, instead of saying, we're only going to study English language materials this semester. Instead, that allowed us to valorize and honor the knowledge that comes into the classroom when you have international students. At the University of Alabama, I've tried to continue that. The student body is a little less international, in part, again, due to government interests. For example, the need for there to be a certain number of in-state students, registered at the university, which is really important to drive the social and economic capacities and development of the state of Alabama. So when I'm teaching here, I still want to bring those international voices in and find ways of doing that. And so working with collaborators internationally is really important. So I was just, prior to our conversation, for example, working on one of my next projects. I think you mentioned it, the one about rethinking the category of theodicy as a global critical philosophy of religion category. And the collaborators on that project will, again, be coming from all over the world. And in my class that I teach next semester, I will be having those people, either their written work or perhaps even using Zoom or some other online tool, to bring them into the classroom and have conversations with people from around the world inside the classroom. But yeah, I can continue, but perhaps you want to clarify or move on to a different question.
Yeah, I mean, you've brought up so many interesting points too. I mean, if I were to paraphrase or maybe sort of supplement what you said a little bit, it sounds like in an internationally diverse classroom, we can almost see like students as themselves being, I don't want to say like a textual source because that sounds a little dehumanizing, but being sources themselves of what they bring to the table and to discussions and that and the diversity and the perspectives that they bring. I think that's a fascinating insight too, and I think that's an important element of pedagogy where there's a sort of like intersubjectivity between teacher and taught, right? Like where there's a sort of emergent understanding that happens when you really allow the students to have their presence and their identity and their experience in the classroom there. I think that's really great. And I think the theme of that being political is very real, right? Especially since a lot of voices are being marginalized. I myself taught at a community college in Sacramento that was profoundly diverse. We had people from all over the world, and
Great.
it created sort of a lot of contention that mirrored sort of the national politics that we're experiencing, the sort of tension around, diversity, immigration, everything else. And I think this is kind of a unique opportunity that I have to be speaking to somebody who's like actually a professor in the red state, like Alabama, that is the deep South. And you're teaching what is arguably one of the most controversial concepts that you're always told, don't talk about politics and don't talk about religion. And here you're sort of, I mean, I almost want to say like the front lines, if that's not too antagonistic, but you're really in like a unique location to be teaching what could be seen as a very politically charged topic in a state where increasingly education is politicized. I wonder if you might want to share any of your experience of how you navigate that. Do you ever get blowback? I mean, I'm sure you do, or maybe if you don't want to discuss those things and you're uncomfortable discussing, that's fine. But I just thought it was like an interesting opportunity to hear from an educator in a state and to hear what your perspectives of what it's like teaching religion in that sort of form.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is too antagonistic to say words like front lines. I certainly think that what we can do as educators is model how that's not the case and how in our classroom we can have academic scholarly discussions of topics. And I really work at helping, I hope, model that and to give students the tools to do that. So when we're emphasizing things like theory and method over top of content, sure. I teach course REL 220, Religions of South Asia. Absolutely. Our content is, you know, giant Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, right? You could divide it into the world religions paradigm stuff and simply teach the content as if what the students need to learn are the Eightfold Path or something like that, right? Or, what are the Mahabharata, right? Like you could just say that's what the course is about. But if you do that, you miss the opportunity to teach people theory and method where the example could be Southern Baptist Church or it could be a Jain temple. The example doesn't matter. It's what are the methods and theoretical perspectives that you're bringing to that notice things. And then what we're teaching students instead is to consider their theoretical standpoints, to select what sorts of methods they're wanting to apply, choose what kinds of questions they're wanting to ask. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't become a front line. Instead, it becomes a community of inquiry. And that's always been important. It's never not been important. And I think it's like really the way to do things. And students love it because, man, I mean, we're in this world of social media that doesn't let us talk to other people. Like, sure, you're posting and you're putting stuff on social media, fine, but you're not really engaging in dialogue with somebody. And when the focus is merely on content, probably you're missing the opportunity for dialogue. When the focus is on theory and method, oh, now we can actually start locating points of conversation, zeroing in on things. I think philosophy has done that really well. Like analytic philosophy of religion has really nicely squared off what are the guardrails and limits of method. The analytic approach has done that really nicely, but along the way, the field of philosophy of religion forgot that that doesn't mean you limit what the content is. So, earlier folks like Keith Yandel, a previous scholar, did understand that and produced a really good textbook about how to use analytic philosophical methods to apply to a variety of examples. And I think that's been happening over the last 25 years. But I'm certainly hoping that this global critical approach can continue to push that forward and that the classroom is the place where this happens. A lot of scholars also make the mistake of saying that their teaching is not their research. And if you're, yeah, sure, the content is different, but surely if you're teaching self-reflexivity and theoretical knowledge and method, well, then actually your research isn't different from your teaching. And so that's another thing that we've tried to do here in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama, to really bring that home and make that case.
Yeah, I concur with that. I know that most of my research projects start with something that I said or did in a classroom, and then they just
Yeah.
flower from there. And a lot of times it's the students themselves who will sort of like provoke a certain line of questioning or something I would have never thought to question. And all of a sudden I'm like writing a paper on it, you know? Yeah.
What was really interesting was in my MA program at the University of Saskatchewan, David Jobling, who's also passed away, said at the first day of class, said, "Who wants to write a journal article with me?" And some of us put up our hands, and sure enough, we were neck deep in academic writing. That was a great way to get involved in that. I also remember Richard Carney at the University of Boston reading one of his books where the footnotes were thanking the students who gave him ideas in class. And I was like, oh yeah, there we are. That's what it is. You not only talk about these things in class, but then you give your students credit by name
That's very cool.
in the process. That's modeling that sort of bridge to people.
Yeah, that's amazing. And talk about uplifting and empowering students. I mean, I see a lot of teaching is actually, I think, in my opinion, the proper approach to being an academic is to actually uplift people. That's your colleagues, your students. I think a lot of times people think of academics as tearing things down a lot, but actually, I think that a lot of what I see good academics doing is seeing somebody they may disagree with, but trying to like uplift them by trying to like share their perspective or trying to, rather than having this sort of like hostile relationship with disagreement, to see it as an opportunity for sort of mutual growth, and then also uplifting our students as well too.
Yeah, and that's like where people misunderstand what the word critical means. Critical doesn't mean denigration. Critical means good faith, robust engagement with your interlocutor.
Yeah.
That's what it means to be critical.
Yeah.
And we've lost that. I mean, popular culture, I don't think ever understood that, but I think that academics have somehow we have not been able to communicate that to our publics,
Yeah.
and that's a missed opportunity,
Yeah.
and that we're now suffering the consequences of not representing the word critical properly to our publics.
Yeah, I agree with you. I often tell my students critical doesn't mean be a jerk, right?
Right.
It's kind of quite the opposite. But speaking of critical and things that get misunderstood, I'm really interested in your sort of use of Derrida, or your how you employ deconstruction, or you definitely have some of that in your monograph. And you've also mentioned analytical philosophy and philosophy of religion as well too. So I wonder if you could tell us about how it is that Derrida, or what aspects of Derrida you might use in your own work, how Derrida has influenced you. You've clearly done a lot of research in that area. Maybe
Mhm.
use deconstruction, how you think deconstruction functions, or and anything else that you might want to say about that, or even since we seem to be talking about responsible scholarship, how deconstruction, because Derrida himself obviously grew up in a very tricky and difficult ideological milieu. Being a
Yep.
Algerian Jew, is not an easy place to be, particularly under the Vichy regime and other places. The sort of oppression inherent in ideological systems, it seems to be really his target. But I'm just wondering if
Yes.
you want to say a little bit more about how you employ Derrida, perhaps in those regards.
I mean, great. I'll put a plug in for the forthcoming book, Philosophies of Self, a cross-cultural introduction. I try to outline some of that in my contribution to that volume. That volume is great because, as I told my undergraduate 100 level class on Monday this week, our methodology is to, one, find an example that is of interest to you. Number two, see versions of that example in different societies. And number three, use those comparative examples to start asking asking questions and proposing hypotheses, and then test out that hypothesis across those various examples. And so that could be conceptions of self. right? And so I showed the students the table of contents for the book, and I said, okay, we've got conceptions of self from the Jain perspective, from the Nguni perspective amongst Southern African continent cultures, Taoist conceptions of self, Buddhist conceptions of self. Derrida, I put forward what I think the conception of self is at work in Derrida's texts. And so we've got, that book provides the basis for students then to ask those kinds of questions. We don't answer that in the book. Of course, I'm sure that some hypotheses come out, but then when we're thinking, okay, now we know if there are different conceptions of self around the world and across history, that whatever I think I am probably could be critically investigated, right? Especially if I think that I'm some sort of self-contained liberal individual, in the line of John Locke and Hobbes and the Enlightenment rationality, that perhaps there are other ways of thinking about who I am. I think that is a fantastic moment. How does that relate to Derrida? I'm going to try to pull a thread through, is to say that Derrida's methodology is then to do really close reading of your comparative sources and to attempt to as faithfully as possible reconstruct them, and in so doing, see what sorts of interesting problems or hypotheses or points of contradiction, emerge from that. So deconstruction, really said quickly, is simply very, very close reading. And that's, one way of being critical is to read ultra, ultra closely to find out what a source is exactly saying. And when you find a point of contradiction or a gap, a logical gap, then to start to reread and ask why that's the case. Yeah, that's a stab at that.
Yeah, yeah. So you find logical contradictions that you can deconstruct. A lot of times would be the relationship between a hierarchical binary that's implicit in the text and sort of how it's nested in with the other sort of symbol systems of the language within that. But that sort of interrogation of hierarchy is kind of the violence of the text. I think Derrida would speak of it is sort of implicit in there too. So there's almost sort of a social justice sort of backdrop to deconstruction as well too, right? Because you're looking for unexamined assumptions of hierarchical binaries where one might be elevated against another in a way that's just assumed and not justified. And I'd say that that leads necessarily to some sort of social awareness and some ethical awareness as well too, right? That seems like a way to sort of interface it with what you're saying about the global critical philosophy, and what you've also said about sort of responsible scholarship as well too. So it seems like deconstruction might kind of fit into that sort of approach to your scholarship that informs your social responsibility. Is that a fair way of characterizing?
Sure. I mean, I think that that's one part of deconstructive practice, discerning binaries, finding hierarchies, understanding how they're constructed and how they work within a text. I think that's definitely one part of Derrida's deconstructive method. And then the comment on violence goes back to his essay on violence and metaphysics in his book Writing Indifference, where Derrida engaged Emmanuel Levinas's philosophy to kind of press that question of textual violence and how it operates phenomenologically, right? So I think that's in there. I've been reading a philosopher who writes in German but is from Korea, Bunchul Han. I, in fact, read through his book, The Topology of Violence, with my seminar a few weeks ago. And Han has been really useful in thinking a little bit further about what we mean when we use the word violence. I don't necessarily agree with all of Han's claims, but certainly that would be a productive book to look at. And I think while Han doesn't mention Derrida in that book at all, I think that Han has read Derrida and has some of those concepts working in the background whilst writing. And so this question of violence, I think, also is much like self, culturally variable, and is a comparative category and is not static, and actually probably needs close examination. And that when a text or discourse uses terms like violence or nonviolence, or, hinsa, and mobilizes those in certain ways, then okay, let's use that method of deconstruction and look at how that binary is functioning within the discourse to set up specific hierarchies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So you've really kind of, I guess, anticipated where I was going with that, is that like violence is really a nice place, Derrida's discourse on violence, or as you had now put it, the deconstruction of the binary, the hierarchical binary between violence and nonviolence, is like, to me, it's an interesting point of engagement with the Jain tradition. Now, I've noticed that you wrote about deconstruction and Derrida and Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
To me, that seems to be like a little bit more of an obvious, maybe not so much for Zen for me. I'm thinking more like Dignaga, Dharmakirta, Pulhavada, Derrida's differences having some conceptual overlap.
Yeah, and there's been lots published on that
Yeah.
since the 1980s.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess my question is, you seem to have brought Derrida into conversation with Zen Buddhism, at least. I'd like to hear about that. But I'm also curious about if you bring Derrida into conversation with the Jain tradition, or maybe, as you have just suggested, how you might deconstruct Jain notions of violence or nonviolence, if that's too much to ask somebody to do on the fly.
Well, I'll say a few things. Number one, I co-wrote that chapter on Derrida. What's the topic again?
Zen Buddhism.
Yeah, and Zen Buddhism with Gary and Kopf, who I co-edited the Engaging Philosophies of Religion volume with. So Purushottam Abhilamoria, Gary and Kopf, and myself were the co-editors of that. Well worth looking at. I learned so much from working with those two amazing colleagues. Both Kopf and Abhilamoria are definitely my mentors in that regard.
Yeah, he was a
So
professor of mine too. I co-edited a volume with Bill Moria as well.
lovely, fabulous. So I think taking a look at that, that chapter emerged from that conversation with Garion, and then thinking about Jain scholarship, I'd have to review what's been published recently to see what people have said, but I think there's a lot probably more to do there. What was fascinating to me when I was, visiting with Jain communities in 2010 was some of the work at digitization that was happening with the Jain Agamas. And I would really like to engage with those people or with those projects and to see what the result of that has been. I think that some interesting computational methods could be used to add on to these close reading methods, right? So Derrida is very much involved in a close reading practice. And when we are using computational methods, some might call it digital humanities. I'd prefer to call it computational humanities or cultural analytics. I think that there's a lot of potential to use not AI, please don't think I'm talking about AI, but to use other computational methods involved in natural language processing to start finding where we could look in novel ways to understand how a community has defined violence and nonviolence. Where does it appear in the text? What sorts of discourses does it find itself in? What are networked concepts? Where are historical connections? Where are textual relationships and semantic relationships? I think there's a lot to be done there. We have the REL Digital Lab here at the Department of Religious Studies, where that's exactly what we do. And so that's an area of scholarship that I'm really interested in pressing forward. I've done that with philosophy of religion, and I'm continuing to do that. But I think that there's a gigantic opening in Jain studies to do computational scholarship. And I think that could apply to texts, but also to physical artifacts and cultural processes. I think that would be fantastically interesting scholarship.
Yeah, that does have a lot of potential and a lot of need as well too, particularly in the field of Jain studies. You did mention your publication on forthcoming publication on Engaged Philosophy of Religions. And you've talked a little bit, you've kind of mentioned it a couple times. I, of course, would like to really hear about that. You may know that Dr. Christopher Miller and I have published a volume, Engaged Jain Studies, where we're in dialogue with Engaged Buddhist Studies. We're
Yes.
exactly copying the methodology. There definitely was some additions. Dr. Miller wrote a brilliant introduction, which kind of went into a lot of more nuanced details of methodologies of engaged studies, which I think, in my opinion, seems to be quite seminal. But I guess I would like to hear a little bit more about what you've done with Engaged Philosophy of Religions, how you discuss that and how you talk about that. And then maybe, if you can, what your thoughts of like Engaged Jain Studies is from your own understanding of what Engaged Philosophies of Religion looks like.
Right. Okay. I think the quick answer would be that Tim Nepper, who's at Drake University, has been a close colleague, and in fact, I think is the founder of the idea of global critical philosophy of religion. Certainly, he and Gary and Kopf are the instigators of this thing way back in 2015. I think Tim has done a lot thinking about comparative methodology, and some of that goes back to his colleague Wes Wildman at Boston University. Or is it? I think at BU. I hope I got that correct. That when we're talking about engaging philosophies of religion, we're trying to say it's comparative with a plus or a yes and to the comparative work done by people like Ninian Smart, who precede us, where we're not doing insider philosophizing. We still are recognizing our role as scholars, right, as academics, but nevertheless, as I said earlier, acknowledging the political implications of our scholarship, to think through how the philosophizing is always embedded in a social and historical context, or social, historical, and political context. So that's the engage part. It's a historicizing move. One example in the forthcoming project and course I'm teaching in the spring is to rethink the concept of theodicy, right? So theodicy currently is thought of as a category that only applies to theism, right? How can an all-powerful, all-knowing creator God exist, or justifiably and legitimately, if there's evil in the world, particularly moral evil and natural evil? Fine. You can think of it that way, but as soon as you delimit it to that discourse on theism and the attributes of God, you've stripped any chance to think about the social, historical, and political function of the reasoning that creates a theodicy in the first place. That's the engagement point. So this project I'm working on is looking not just, is looking to expand theodicy as a concept that could be applied to a lot of different historical, geographic situations to identify a kind of reasoning. So a theodicy reasoning scenario is one where you have a hegemonic power that is recognized to be, in control of a social situation, that nevertheless its legitimacy and justification are challenged by events of suffering within that situation. And the theodicy reasoning is whatever that hegemonic power produces in order to justify itself to its constituents. So when you think of theodicy that way, well, now we can be talking about residential schools and indigenous people in North America. We can be talking about various Chinese dynasties and the reasoning that either the Moists or the Ruists or the Taoists have produced in order to legitimate the rulership of that particular dynasty. We could even potentially be looking at Jain philosophers participating in royal courts who think about these things. So it's not the problem of evil. Instead, it's the question of how hegemony justifies itself to its constituents given suffering in a particular social context. And that starts to make for a philosophy of religion, a way of philosophizing about religion that gets to be historicized, it gets to be engaged. So that's a different kind of engaged from what we see with engaged Buddhism, right? that's a different discourse that we could analyze with what I just explained, right? So if we look at different involvements of different Buddhist organizations in development projects, right? Economic development projects, such as the delivery of healthcare. There certainly are engaged Buddhist organizations involved in that. Okay, well, now let's look at that and see what sort of role they're playing in manufacturing a theodicy for that social historical situation. That's plausible. That could happen. There have been Buddhist rulers, throughout time. How did they justify themselves to their constituents given suffering? It's not just a nice, neat little argument about karma. Instead, it now has to involve the social and historical context that they found themselves in. And that produces then it's comparatively productive rather than isolated to theism.
I see. So it seems to me that, taking your example of theodicy, that what you look at is engaged. First of all, engaged Buddhism is oftentimes like social engagement and a move towards activism, which is very
Yeah,
different than what you're talking about.
absolutely.
They employ part of that in some of the constructive work in engaged Jainism. But I think a lot of what you're saying, historicizing concepts, but it also seems like maybe broadening the purview of theological or religious concepts in a way that understands them in their historical context and maybe a method of inquiry beyond like its usual use. Like theodicy is usually monotheistic, right? But in
Right.
this case, you're talking about, any institutions of power that need justification using a similar, I almost want to say like a similar analytical pattern
Yeah.
that what we would see in theodicy. So to you, am I fair in saying that engagement for you is sort of like understanding sort of like the patterns behind religious thought and how they can be like applied in situations that are not normally what we would think of?
Yeah.
I guess I want a little bit more clarity on what you mean by the historicization of it.
Right. Oh, I mean, so if we go back to just the emergence of theodicy as a category, the category emerges at certain times in European history of basically social change, right? You have the fall of the late Roman Empire, you have the emergence of early modern Europe, and then you have the end of World War II, right? Those are the points where I think there's a zenith in theodical discourse, right? So those those social events and historical events can't be unrelated to the production of these discourses justifying the goodness of the Christian God vis-a-vis the suffering found in the world,
Mm.
right? So if you take that as your starting point, then you're saying, okay, this isn't something limited to thinking about the Christian or Abrahamic or theistic God. Actually, this is a pattern of thinking that we might be able to find in other places. And so that's our hypothesis. And we go out looking for other examples that could do likewise. And if this book project works, then we could say this idea has some validity. It's not that we have determined some sort of metaphysical truth. Often people think that that's what the business of philosophy is. Fine, sure, but that can't be all that it is,
It seems
or at
like
least I hope it isn't.
Yeah, it seems like what you're maybe moving towards is some degree of commensurability.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that seems to be okay. That's fascinating. I think I got a good understanding of that. That was really nice explanation. Thank you for your clarity on that. We are coming to the end of our time, and I was wondering, I mean, just to maybe end on something a little bit lighter, if you have any advice. I mean, come on, being a philosopher professor, I'm sure you have students all the time who like want to major in philosophy and want to pursue philosophy, but then their family says, "What are you going to do with it?" But I wonder if you have any advice for students or early career academics who are maybe interested in religious studies of philosophy, and maybe how you envision the future of philosophy of religion, particularly like the cross cultural interdisciplinary stuff we've been talking about.
Well, I think the quick answer would be to take a look at our terminal MA that we offer at the Department of Religious Studies. When we admit graduate students, we tell them this is not a program that will prepare you for being a PhD university professor. Instead, the entire point of our religious studies MA is to prepare them for entering the workforce with a set of skills that are, again, learning different methods for studying cultural phenomena, learning different theories of approaching cultural phenomena and discerning and finding them. But then our other core requirement in the MA program is what I just called cultural analytics, how to use computational methods to study broad form, large scale cultural phenomena, right? So if that's the emphasis of the MA program, and I guess a third emphasis is public humanities. So how do you communicate your research results to a variety of public audiences that you've identified? If those are the core parts of your graduate program, which they are at UA in religious studies, then we're preparing people for professional skills that can be used in a whole range of areas. So our students, if you look, I could find the link, but on our webpage, we are really we emphasize where our students have gone. Some of them are working as web developers. Some of them are working as analysts in industry, using their computational skills that they gained. Others are working in various defense and intelligence agencies, using, again, cultural theory, digital skills, right? Cultural theory did it. We have students who are now curating museums. They're taking their public, that sense of like, okay, what does it mean to communicate to publics, translating that into curating museum collections and managing museums. We have students working in NGOs doing the same thing. Like, once you think about what are the skills that religious studies can develop in somebody, oh my goodness, like you can take a religious studies degree anywhere, right? And you add into that cross-cultural understanding, oh my goodness, who wouldn't want to hire a religious studies major? Right? Like someone who's trained to be a CPA in accounting, great, fine. I'm sure they have a wonderful private life that is diverse, but all they've learned to do is accounting. Our students can learn accounting, fine. Like, that's not hard. No diss on people who do stats and know how to work an Excel sheet 5 ways from Friday. But we teach our students the digital skills to learn those platforms. We teach them the theoretical and methodological handles to be entrepreneurial enough to go anywhere. I mean, I'm selling my department's program big time here, but I seriously think take a look at our religion.ua.edu, look at our grad program, and your answer is right there.
Yeah, that's a great way to end on. I think it's important to note that religion really is tied to every major social issue.
Yeah.
There's You can't really find any corner of the world that religion isn't somehow intrinsically applied to. And I've also heard recent statistics about how surprising it is that certain companies favor humanities degrees because of favoring things like critical thinking and communication skills and writing skills and
Yeah.
sort of thing. So yeah, I think that there's a very important need for humanities in our society, particularly religious studies, even if people popularly don't always recognize the importance of that. So thank you for being an important voice, an important teacher, for bringing religious studies in such an important way to our society in a way that's socially relevant, and for your really engaged and relevant scholarship. It's been a real pleasure to hear about that all today. Do you have any other last thoughts that you want to share, or?
No, just as I said, there's no such thing as a front line. They're only collaborators and discussants and people to engage with and talk to. And I think that's how we need to conduct ourselves as so-called engaged academics or activist scholars. We're all that, if that's our approach.
All right, that's perfect. It's a beautiful vision. All right, thank you, Dr. Loewen, and I appreciate you being on our program today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum, spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more, can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.